Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual presentation, Researching Black Ancestry in Essex County, Resources and Methods. My name is Nate Bryant, and I serve as the Vice President for Student Success at Salem State University, and am honored to serve as a trustee for Essex Heritage. Today is Friday, April 29, 2022, and we are happy to welcome everyone to this program for the second annual Salem Ancestry Days. A few important notes before we begin. First, there are live captions available for those that would prefer them. In the menu at the bottom of your screen, you will want to select Closed Caption and then select Show Subtitle to enable that feature. To turn it off, select Hide Subtitle. Again, in the menu at the bottom of your screen, you will want to select Closed Caption and then Show Subtitle to enable the feature. And again, to turn it off, select Hide Subtitle. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A with our presenters. Please submit your questions by typing them into the chat box at any point during the talk. And we will get to as many of them as we can before the program ends. And finally, this presentation will be recorded and made available on the Essex Heritage YouTube channel. And we will provide you the link to the recording to all attendees once it is uploaded. And now for the program. We are happy to welcome 4 speakers from around Essex National Heritage area who have researched and helped to interpret the story of Essex County's Black residents. The story of Essex County is one of diversity, both in demographics and in surviving historical records. In recent years, there has been a surge in the number of research projects done to uncover and interpret records and resources that shed light on the Black residents of Essex County from the 17th century to the present. These resources have allowed historians, genealogists, family history researchers to better understand the diverse communities in the region and build a more complete picture of our history. Let me introduce you to our presenters tonight. Charles Shaw is a member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. Lauren McCormack is the Executive Director of the Marblehead Museum. Lou Meyi is a member of the Marblehead Racial Justice Team. And Beth Bauer is an archivist and public historian and Essex Heritage trustee. And our first presenter tonight will be Charles Shaw to discuss how he traced his own family history back to several Essex County communities. Charles Shaw is a 9th generation native of Massachusetts, has traced his maternal genealogy in New England and Canadian Maritimes to the late 17th century. He has been actively involved in family research for nearly 30 years and has journeyed more than 1,000 miles in search of answers to mysteries of his family's past. Mr. Shaw, while not a professional genealogist, admits to having little interest in genealogy or family history until reaching midlife when his curiosity was piqued by the Census of 1850. It was that single enumerated sheet that set him on a course of a decades-long search for answers and truths behind stories and lore passed down from generations past. He recalls hearing stories about remote islands off the coast of Mount Desert Island off the coast of Maine to the narrow streets of Beacon Hill. Among other tales were that of great-great-grandfather's 19th century chandlery on the Boston waterfront, and another that involved the enigma of a man known as the Old Dutchman, and most intriguing, the story known by many in the family of a soldier of the Revolution who served at Bunker Hill. Over 30 years ago, Mr. Shaw set out on a genealogical journey to learn the truth behind the family lore. Mr. Shaw's focus on Essex County will address ancestors who lived in or migrated to Beverly, Newburyport, Marblehead, and Lynn. Charles Shaw is an active member of the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society, New England Chapter Incorporated, and is past member of Boston's Beacon Hill Scholars. He is a father of 2 adult children and lives with a wife of 38 years in a quiet town west of Boston. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Charles Shaw. Charles?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Ryan. Boy, that was quite an introduction. Hope it'll calm my nerves. It is true. I am a 9th generation Massachusetts native. I can trace my line back to almost the 11th, maybe 12th generation in the Canadian Maritimes. It was my mother who actually set me off on this course. She was very much into genealogy, but I really never paid much attention to it, as I said, until I reached my midlife. And I started to look back and says, maybe there was something to these stories. And I wanted to go check on them myself. And so my wife and I, and she was very helpful in this, set out to discover if these stories I had heard growing up were true. And I've been for all over New England, highest circumference of Nova Scotia. I've been in touch with family members from England to Alaska, people I've come across searching the same family relatives. It has been quite an adventure for the last 30 years. Tonight, I'm going to focus on Essex County and two relatives, one who lived here and one who migrated here. So I'd like to get on with my slide presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions after. So I'm going to go to a screen share now. Hope this works. Okay, ancestors of Essex County. The origins of some of my New England ancestors lay in the Dunmore Proclamation. In a little known story of the American Revolution, British commanders offered protection, freedom, and land to any Black, whether enslaved, indentured, or freeborn, in exchange for service and loyalty to the crown. Thousands of Blacks accepted this offer, deserting their enslavers and crossing over to the British lines. In spite of losing the war, upwards to 3,000 Black men, women, and children were evacuated from New York by the British at the close of the war, evacuated to Nova Scotia in 1783. They became known as the Black Loyalists. Now, they were promised freedom, which they did have, and land, which they got very little of, and protection. I will tell you that from things I have researched, and it is true, one of the first landing places of the Blacks who evacuated to Nova Scotia was Shelburne. And just as a note, Shelburne, believe it or not, was the location of the very first race riot in North America. It is an oft-told story we've heard before where the white loyalists, the people who wanted to stay loyal to England, became jealous of the Blacks for taking their work, taking their jobs for less money. I'm trying to advance my screen here. Now, I've traced my maritime ancestors to distinct locations on Nova Scotia, which were the original Loyalist settlements, many in the Annapolis Valley. Also, you have Digby, you have Yarmouth, you have Shelburne. These are the locations that many of the evacuees were deposited when they reached Nova Scotia. They actually were let loose in a pretty much of a wilderness, a place of rocky soil and pine. The British government supported them for about 2 years. And mind you, there were 3,000 Blacks with about 36,000 whites who wanted nothing to do with this new thing called United States. So they wanted to stay loyal to the crown. One ancestor, David Fowler, a descendant of the refugees evacuated from New York in 1783, sailed from Annapolis, Nova Scotia, arriving at Marblehead, Massachusetts in 1870, aboard the schooner Meteor. Described as a carpenter and stonecutter, he came to the Boston States, which is a term the Maritimers used for New England and the Boston area, in search of work, and would later be joined by his wife, Anne, and their 2 young sons. They were the second and third of my great-great-grandparents to migrate from maritime Canada. Here's a manifest, the schooner Meteor. You see his name here, David Fowler. He was 27 years old when he first arrived in Boston. I should say in Marblehead. He had made the trip a few times because he came here and he left his family behind in Annapolis. He came here looking for employment. Now, it's unclear how long David lived in Marblehead before moving to Lynn, where shoe factories and textile mills offered ready employment. According to other manifests, David sailed home to Nova Scotia several times. Eventually, he returned to Lynn with his family in the early 1880s. So here you have Essex County, you have Marblehead, where he first set foot, and Lynn, which is not too far away. But that's where the family settled. They stayed in Lynn for about 20 years. Here you have the family, U.S. City Directories, 1822 to 1995, David Fowler. You have David here listed as a laborer. He boards at 27 Fayette Court. But oddly, and I had noticed this, and I asked myself why, Mrs. Fowler removed to Cambridge. And I wondered, why did she move from Cambridge and leave David behind? By the way, Charles the shoemaker at the top, that was one of his sons that came with him. And mind you, this is 1894. This is like, God, probably about 14 years after they came. Now, David and Ann Fowler had 7 children, 6 of whom were born in Canada. Only their youngest child, Arthur, was born in Lynn, Massachusetts in 1885. At age 6, Arthur moved from Lynn to Cambridge with his mother and older brother. David remained in Lynn until moving to Cambridge some years later. So there was some separation thing going on there with my great-great-grandparents. It may have to do with them being left in Canada for so long while he was living here. After the birth of their last child, David and Ann Fowler are found never living together again. Ann preceded her husband in death for 12 years, and David lived on to the age of 100. In the end, both returned to Lynn in death, and now rest a short distance from the other at Pine Grove Cemetery. In 1905, their youngest son, Arthur, married Ruth, a young Cambridge woman, married her in Essex County at a chapel near Revere Beach. Like Arthur, Ruth had Canadian roots and was a descendant of the Black Loyalist evacuees of 1783. And together, they would raise 6 children in Cambridge and live to see many grand and great-grandchildren, one of whom would become this researcher. Now we move on to a man by the name of Daniel Over of Newburyport, my 4th great-grandfather. Daniel Over was born in Essex County in 1785. Now, it's fairly certain he was born in Newburyport, where a brief record of his life exists. However, the Boston death registry of his eldest daughter, Asenath, in 1873, indicates his place of birth was Beverly. No other documentation of a Beverly relationship has been uncovered. And I have a feeling that may have to do with a secondary source. In other words, the person who reported her death may not have known really where her father was born and told them it was Beverly. Now, the first record discovered of Daniel Over in Newburyport is the birth of his daughter, Hannah, on November 22nd, 1805. Look at the red arrow. It says, Hannah, daughter of, I got that wrong. Yeah, she was born in 1805 on November 22nd. And it says specifically here, Daniel Over, his daughter, she was born in May of that year. Unfortunately, his child would live little more than 6 months, only to be followed by the death of her mother 11 days later. What it reads here, it says, Hannah, daughter of Mr. Daniel Over, granddaughter of Benoni Knapp, died November 30th, 1805. And his wife, Hannah, wife of Daniel Over, died on December 11th, the same year in 1805. Now, in research over the years, and I've been doing this, as I said, for 30 years, I've learned that it is not unusual for tragedy or the loss of a loved one to be the driving force behind individuals choosing to relocate, to leave behind bad memories. It appears that young Daniel Over, with nothing to remain in Newburyport for, chose to leave. After 1805 deaths of his wife and child, Daniel appears nowhere until 5 years later, when his name is listed in the US Census of 1810 at St. George, Maine. Now a widower and likely still mourning the deaths of his wife and daughter, he is listed living alone in the town of St. George. As it was announced by Nate, I have traveled over 1,000 miles in search of answers to these mysteries. And I have been to St. George. And I've been pretty much all over Maine to where my family lived at one time. It is very moving to set foot in a place that you've been told about as a child. It was these mystical places. And it was quite an experience to go to St. George and to Thomaston, as well as to Belfast, seeking answers to the mysteries of my family. US Census, 1820. By 1820, Daniel is no longer living alone, but living with at least 2 or 3 other individuals in his household. He's right down here. On the side here, it says St. George. It's the 1820 census. Another 10 years goes by, 1840. By the census of 1840, Daniel Over is now listed as living with several free colored persons, including one female listed as white, his wife, whose name was Nancy. This is an undated list of the Over family in St. George. I found this probably about 15 years ago, and at the time, I do not remember where I obtained it. Because at the time, I did not expect myself to be giving a presentation like this. But you can see Daniel Over listed here, born in September of 1785 in Massachusetts, and his wife, Nancy. She was born, he actually died in May of 1865. Also are his children, his daughter, Asnith, who the one who we mentioned who died in Boston. Over here, between 1816 and 1830, although not listed, I have a feeling this may be one of his daughter by the name of Emma, who was actually my 3rd great grandmother. By the census of 1850, it is clear that Daniel, listed as a fisherman, has created a whole new life and family for himself in St. George. It is noteworthy that wife Nancy is sometimes known as Nancy Butler, as interracial marriage was still illegal in the state of Maine. In this census here, all are listed as mixed race, mulattoes, except for Nancy. So you have Daniel, you have Nancy, you have his oldest daughter, Asnith. You have a son, Abraham, a William, and a John. Down here, I believe, are nephews. My search for Daniel Over has taken me to the Essex County towns of Beverly and Newburyport, but most rewarding was the response to an email inquiry sent to the final resting place of Daniel and his wife, Nancy, at the Seaside Cemetery located at Tennant Harbor, Maine. Now, a very helpful cemetery custodian offered what information he could on the Overs, and then sent a photo of their lichen-encrusted headstone. Taking a sincere interest in my story, he invited me to visit the cemetery. And in the summer of 2012, I traveled to Seaside Cemetery, which is situated atop a hill overlooking the Gulf of Maine. I learned the custodian had taken it upon himself to clean the stone in anticipation of my visit. And I was very grateful for his handiwork. And this is the grave of Daniel Over and his wife, Nancy, at Seaside Cemetery. My wife and I couldn't believe this was the same stone. We thought, my goodness, this is new. But it's amazing, he did an incredible job. Now, what I have learned in doing this research is not only sitting in front of a computer, which I've probably spent about maybe 40 of my % time doing, but the other is hard work, actually visiting archives, going to libraries, visiting cemeteries. But one of the most effective ways I have gathered information and learned things is by making contact with a person, making contact with an archivist, someone who has taken genuine interest in your story, and they will go above and beyond. And truly, and I have learned many, many things I would never have learned on my own by these very helpful people. These are the descendants of David Fowler and Daniel Over. That's my great-grandparents in the middle. That's Arthur and Ruth. My parents are actually in the back smiling. And I think you might see me between my great-grandfather's knees. Just take it back to 1905. I'm sorry, 1955, on their 50th anniversary. So I want to thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Charles. I was going to say, you look damn good for 1905.
It's the makeup.
Thank you, that was really great, appreciate it. Next are Lauren McCormack and Lou Meyi to talk about recent efforts to record and publicize the history of the Black population in Marblehead and the programs and resources that have come out of these efforts. First, let me introduce Lauren. Lauren McCormack has served as the Executive Director of the Marblehead Museum since 2018. Prior to that, she was the Project Director for a $250,000 Institute of Museum and Library Services National Leadership Grant, Engaged Families, with the USS Constitution Museum, where she led a team that studied best practices for encouraging encouragement and learning among and between all family members in museum programming, called Engaged Families, or the website is engagedfamilies.org. McCormack served as the research coordinator and mass humanities scholar in residence for the USS Constitution Museum, where she studied people of color who served in the US Navy during the War of 1812. McCormack has a Master's of Arts degree in American History from Brandeis University and a Master's of Arts degree in American and New England Studies from BU, where her major paper was a study of the community of color living on the North Shore of Boston's Beacon Hill in the early 19th century. I'd like to now introduce Lou Meyi. Lou Meyi spent his youth in New Orleans, Louisiana, where one experiences history and ancestry around just about every corner. Lou went north to the Chicago area to earn his undergrad and graduate degrees, then began a federal civil service career with the U.S. General Services Administration Regional Office in Chicago. At the time, National Archives and its regional offices were part of GSA. A dream assignment for Lou in the 1970s was an internship with the regional archivist for the Midwest, where Lou participated in cataloging federal court records from the 19th century when those locations were in their infancy as states. A resident of Marblehead for 40+ years, Lou constantly had an eye out for African-American history in the Essex County and the Boston area. He was fortunate that during his federal employment in Boston, he had a role in several major multi-agency Black History Month activities, which sparked yet more interest. He feels extra fortunate that in his past few years, his affiliation with the Marblehead Racial Justice Team has led to associations with Essex Heritage, National Park Service Salem Maritime, and most meaningfully, with Marblehead Museum and Lauren McCormack as the Executive Director. I present to you Lauren McCormack and Lou Meyi.
Thank you, Nate. Let me go ahead and share my screen.
Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be together. Thank you, Nate, for the introductions. Also great to be paired with the other presenters and Nate. It was serendipitous that Marblehead Racial Justice Team began to supplement our more typical justice-focused work, and we moved into projects related to African-American history around the same time Lauren began at Marblehead Museum some years ago. We've collaborated quite a bit, as you'll see during this segment, both in terms of uncovering resources and highlighting fascinating historical details of life for some people of color in Marblehead. Let's get started by focusing on two people of color who made quite an impact in the late 1700s and early 1800s, a husband and wife, Joseph and Lucretia Brown. Marblehead Racial Justice Team did a short video on them that has had over 1,000 views. Lauren will go from here with more about research on Mr. and Mrs. Brown.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Essex Heritage, for having us. Happy to be here and share with you. What we thought we would do is share with you some of the research and sources that we use to study some of the individuals that we've learned about. And we, as Lou said, we'll start with Joseph and Lucretia Brown, who are a very special couple to the history of Marblehead for many reasons. And ever since their deaths in 1830s and 1850s, respectively, there's been a lot of myth and lore around them. And that was sort of codified, if you will, by the publication of Samuel Rhodes' History and Traditions of Marblehead in the late 1880s, early 1890s through various editions. And I bring this up because a lot of towns, especially during the Colonial Revival period, have publications like History and Traditions of Marblehead. And a lot of us have used them and really believed in them for many years. And what I've come to learn is that as great as they are and important as they are, take them with a grain of salt. For instance, we believed for many years that Joseph Brown was a member of, born in Marblehead and a member of General John Glover's famous Marblehead regiment during the Revolutionary War. We believed that his wife Lucretia was born to parents who had been enslaved by a family in town and then freed during the Revolutionary War. And it turns out that neither of those things were correct. And I'd like to share with you some of the sources we used to figure this out. So many of you are familiar with vital records, and I list here, and I do throughout, sources, most of them free, that you can find some of this information yourself. And mavitalrecords.org is a really helpful source for finding records. When you go to the town you're interested in, they have the Negro section, quote unquote, and oftentimes Indians as well, separated down at the bottom. But what I would say, and what we've learned, is that sometimes, every once in a while, people of African descent are sort of mixed in with everybody else. But also, don't just look in the community that you think you're interested in. Like for us, Joseph and Lucretia being in Marblehead, well, I knew Lucretia's parents' names, so I started looking around in other towns, and lo and behold, found her parents' marriage record in the Lynn Vital Records. And I think this speaks to something that we'll see again and again, which is that the communities of people of color were broader oftentimes than just the political boundaries of a town. And that can be for many reasons. And sometimes it isn't because they wanted to go outside of their town, but they were forced to because of the persons who enslaved them were bringing them to a country estate. For instance, Peter Thomas, listed here, Lucretia's father, was a resident at Colonel Jacob Fowler's. So there's a lot of, who was a Marblehead resident who had a country estate in Lynn. So there's a lot of these opportunities to find people where you might not think initially to look. And that actually served us quite well with Lucretia. And then of course, military records. I mentioned that we thought Joseph was in Glover's regiment. Well, it turns out, thanks to Curtis White, who found Joseph's pension record, he was actually in a regiment in Rhode Island where he was born in North Kingstown and served there. We also learned from this pension record that he was actually enslaved. People in Marblehead thought he was born a free man, but he was enslaved as a young man until he was free from serving as a substitute for his enslaver's son during the Revolution. And the great thing about pension records, and why I always like to look to them, is that they have such amazing information that you're required to basically give your life story and why where you served and where you came from and why you deserve this pension. So they're a great source if you can to find more information about an individual, oftentimes in his own words, even if not written down by him, but told by him. Another source that served us really well, which is free and available online, are the Salem deeds. So the Southern Essex County Registry of Deeds has full text online. And so for Joseph, we always believed that he had owned a house in town, but the story is a little bit more complicated. So when I go to his deed, I find out, in fact, that he started with only half a house. He bought half a house, and then a few years later, he bought the other half. And what's great about the deed is we also learn, as you see here, I'll put my cursor over it, we get an occupation. It's Joseph Brown of Marblehead, laborer. That's great. That's something that we didn't know at the time. And newspapers. Been so helpful now that so many of them, including the ones for Salem and Essex County, are mostly online, searchable, full text. The only problem is you oftentimes have to go to a university library to find this database, but it is out there. And it's been a great source for things like death notices, and I'll talk about a few other things later on. And the death notices for so many of these people have been so wonderful to find, and especially Joseph and Lucretia's. It just tells an amazing story of the role that they played in Marblehead, in the community of Marblehead. As it says here for Lucretia on the left, she was a well-known, highly esteemed and respectable colored lady who was an eminently industrious and useful member of society. And it goes on to laud her and how wonderful she was. And these things give us such a better understanding of Joseph and Lucretia, their role in the community, and how people viewed them. And
Next,
as Lou, yeah, sorry, I was going to say, as Lou said, please do go to his website and see his video about Joseph and Lucretia.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that plug. Next, two women in Marblehead, a century apart, with very unique situations at death. Agnes is one, and then we'll highlight another lady, Venus Freeman. Agnes lived in town as an enslaved woman, known only by her first name, in the late 1600s and early 1700s. She had the unique circumstance that at death, her burial was in the main town cemetery, different than the result for all other enslaved people, as far as we can tell. She died in 1718, had a gravestone in a spot at her resting place, and the gravestone endured remarkably into the latter half of the 20th century. Then it disappeared from vandalism. Marblehead Racial Justice Team decided something had to get done to restore the gravestone of Agnes. Through the help of many good people, with a particular shout out to a Marblehead High School student, we succeeded with fundraising in 5 figures to restore the stone. Artisans carved an exact reproduction. We achieved approvals from the town and the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and the stone is now installed. A dedication ceremony, to which you're all invited, will follow at a later date. Lauren?
This is such a great story, and such kudos to Marblehead Racial Justice Team and Lou in particular for getting this project off the ground. We in the museum were just so fortunate that we were able to put our hands on a photo of the original stone, which you see here on the left, from probably about 1897. And it's just fabulous that they were able to recreate the stone and put it right back in pretty much the exact spot the original one was in. And so we were working we knew the stone existed even before we found the photo. That came from this printed guide Old Barley Hill and Marblehead. But there are many guides and many listings that exist in local historical societies and even online now for gravestones in various cemeteries in various towns in Essex County. And a lot of those come from the Colonial Revival period when people were particularly interested in documenting the old stones and especially the Revolutionary War soldiers. But you can see here how somebody had copied down what was on the stone here. So that was a great thing to have. And I encourage you to look for those things as well. And I also mentioned, I mistakenly misspelled it, but findagrave.com. Of course, that doesn't have everything because it's crowdsourced, but it's a great place to start as well. For Agnes, though, she also appears in the church records, particularly of St. Michael's Episcopal Church, which was where the Russell family worshipped in the early 18th century. And so this here is the full page and then a close-up of her entry in the Episcopal Church records. And I will note that I'm pretty sure that exclamation point at the end is a later addition by somebody who thought this was pretty special. But it's a great source. And so, of course, local churches oftentimes have their own archives and keep their own records. But in some cases, particularly in the congregational churches in New England and Essex County, the Congregational Library and Archives has a great website where they've been going around and scanning all the church records that exist at the churches, as well as at museums and historical societies like ours. And so they're a great source, even though they're not searchable by name. If you have an approximate date, you can sort of scroll through, and many of them are also transcribed. So that's been very helpful in all of our research. And then probate record. And I think this is going into this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But Agnes, we're pretty sure, almost 100% sure, that in Samuel Russell's probate inventory, which was taken after his death, in there you can see it highlighted, was listed, quote, one Negro woman. And that we're pretty sure is Agnes. And of course, it doesn't give her name. It does give a value. And it's interesting also to look where in the probate inventory you might find individuals. In this case, she's listed among woodenware, earthenware, kitchenware, basically, trivets and things like that, as well as an old boat. So it's very telling, but oftentimes you can see, based on where they're listed, sometimes you can tell where it's in the kitchen, or maybe they had a garret space or something like that. So great resources available at AmericanAncestors.org. And I believe still that the Essex County probate records are one of the things you can access by just getting a login, but not necessarily having to pay the full fee for that. Now here we have Agnes, who is literally not even a name, just a mention in a probate inventory. But there are other inventories, mostly in the early 19th century, where you can learn a ton more about these individuals because it's their probate record, it's their inventory. So here on the left is Venus Freeman's from when her death in 1837. And on the right, just as an example, there's so much more than inventories in these records, right? You have all this administrative paperwork. And from that, you can learn who the estate administrator was, who some of their friends were, their colleagues or their family members. So it's a great genealogical and research source that I encourage you to use. Lou?
Another instance where we've brought a lot more to light about circumstances affecting Black people's lives concerns discriminatory events in 1788. This was not long after the end of the War for Independence and the Massachusetts court ruling that slavery was incompatible with the 1780 state constitution. Economic stresses plagued government at several levels during this time. A feature connected to the economic stresses was a practice called warning out, quote unquote. Much research has been produced about a 1789 Massachusetts warning out law, but our Marblehead focus has been on a law 1 year earlier. It specified people of color for disparate treatment in warning out. Just one more discriminatory hurdle for Black people striving to make a life in that era. The 1789 law did not specify race, but the 1788 law did. And Lauren will take up the story.
So here you have a printed version of this law But what's important to us is how Marblehead deals with it, as Lou says. And so in the town record, the meeting minutes, which are available online, and many Essex County towns are, through familysearch.org, which is a free site that you can just sign up for. I was able to track down the actual mentions in the town record about the warning out and the list that they were meant to make. And the most amazing thing, though, is that for Marblehead, at least, the list still exists. And it's a little hard to read. It's not a good scan. I apologize. It's in the records of the Marblehead Historical Commission. But what you see here is the April 1788, a list of Negroes residing in this town. And here we have the names in the left column, but also whether they had a wife or not, whether they're married. Of course, the names are almost all men. And then whether they were married, how many children they had. And what's really interesting for Marblehead, and it's something that hopefully somebody will do a thesis project on, because I think there's a lot to be discovered here, is note these two columns. I'll put my cursor on them. The first one is Massachusetts, and we see how many people here were born in Massachusetts. And then we have a column for Rhode Island, and how many people were originally from Rhode Island. And there's definitely a connection between Massachusetts, at least Essex County, Massachusetts, or Marblehead at least, with Rhode Island. I mentioned earlier that Joseph Brown, for instance, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, although not in a Marblehead regiment, but he was from North Kingstown, Rhode Island. And a number of these people listed here were originally from North or South Kingstown, Rhode Island, and then moved up to Marblehead after the war. And so there's a couple of theories of, don't really have time to go into it now, but probably something to do with the Marblehead Regiment serving in Rhode Island for an early part of the war, and maybe meeting these folks, and maybe there was something about Marblehead, there were jobs available, or something brought people to the town afterwards. But it's a really fascinating listing of individuals, great for genealogy and research. So it'd be worth looking into other towns. And we know Salem has the later one, but other towns in Essex County too, to see if they have them as well. I did want to just mention a few other sources that we found really helpful in the research that we're doing that are available almost always freely online. And that is, of course, tax records. A lot of them are in your town locally, but in 1771, the colony did a tax. Now, you're not going to find the individual person of colors, or I should say specifically enslaved person's name in these, but if you have a white family's name that you think might be linked somehow, you can go into this, find the name, and see whether or not they're listed as having an enslaved person in their household. Now, granted, I always say when I'm looking at tax records, I always think these are people who are self-reporting. Maybe they're not self-reporting everybody, right? If it's something you're going to get taxed on and you can get away with it, maybe you're not going to give the entire information out to the colony. Census records, of course, that Chuck touched on, super helpful. I love this one in particular, which is, I believe it's 1800. It's either 1800 or 1810. My apologies. I don't remember off the top of my head, because here in the column, there's a column for slaves. And this, of course, is after that time period in Massachusetts, at least legally, but also all other free persons. And what's interesting here is that we have Philip Bessem, who is a white man. He has a bunch of white people in his household. He also has one person of color in his household. And that gives us just a clue to go off of to try to find this individual. And right below him is Cato Barjona, who was a person of color, and he had 4 people in his household. So that's a great method, great way to find people that you're interested in. There's also the 1754 Massachusetts slave census and the 1765 lost census, so-called lost census of Massachusetts. Now, you're not going to get names again from these records, but numbers in town to give you a sense. Like in 1765's lost census for Marblehead, there's exactly 100 people of African descent living in Marblehead, it's a helpful information. And then I mentioned newspapers earlier, and I wanted just to come back briefly to runaway ads and also sale advertisements, because there's so much information, and we've found so many for Marblehead. And what you get out of these documents, these descriptions are wonderful, because you learn a little bit sometimes about their occupation. You learn a little bit about how old they are, where they were born sometimes. And sometimes you can only tell that because of their English is not good. So they were maybe born in Africa or born somewhere else and enslaved from there, but great sources. And there are some websites here that have a lot online that are searchable. And then of course the newspapers you can search as well.
Another source that we just are so pleased to have that features both the Marblehead Museum and Marblehead Racial Justice Team is from National Park Service, Salem Maritime. And there's a link on the screen, but it's very easy to navigate to just from the National Park Service, Salem Maritime homepage. It's entitled African Americans in Essex County, Massachusetts, an Annotative Guide. It was a number of years in the making and was fully fleshed out and published earlier in 2022 this year. You can see a page excerpt there that describes some of the Marblehead Racial Justice Team historical activity. There's so much in here done by the principal investigators, Dr. Cabria Baumgartner and Dr. Elizabeth Duclos-Orsello, just wonderful professors and researchers who have made a document that covers so many towns in Essex County, ranging from the A's and over all the way to the S's and Salem and everything in between. And you heard Lauren mention a moment ago that it was erroneous that an African-American person, Joseph Brown, was in General Glover's regiment, a famous Revolutionary War unit. But you can find in African Americans in Essex County mention in the Beverly Historical Society website, Historic Beverly, an enslaved person who actually was in General Glover's regiment. And so they're the tidbits, both in terms of research methodology and the kind of thing we're trying to bring up here as well, particular stories about the fellow, for example, in Beverly, who had the same last name as his enslaver, the prominent Beverly named Hale. So we really recommend African Americans in Essex County, Massachusetts, an annotated guide. And thank you so much to National Park Service for giving that grant to Dr. Baumgartner and Dr. Duclos-Orsello.
Absolutely. And I wanted to share one culmination of some of this research, and it is ongoing. But it became important to us as we were doing some of this research to really move beyond names and dates and to tell a more complete story about the individuals of color who lived in Marblehead. And so we decided to put together a database, and it has launched and is available online. And as I said, it's a work in progress. So there are hundreds of names that we want to research to really bring out more of the stories of the individual and their and what they did for the community and how they lived their lives and what we can learn about them. And so we've started with about 50 names or so, and we have many more to add and much research to do. If anybody's interested in helping with research, just let me know. We have tons of people to look into, and they're really fascinating stories. So we launched this database a few months ago. It's on our website, marbleheadmuseum.org. And for each person that we have discovered, we have a page for each person. And we wanted to move beyond the sort of list database, birth, death, things like that, and make it a little bit more accessible by writing a narrative of what we found. But in addition to the narrative that you see here, we also wanted you to have direct access to the primary source documentation upon which the narratives are based. So at the bottom of every page, you'll also see links to the actual documents, whether it's a pension record, whether it's a birth record or a baptismal record or something to that effect, so that you have the primary source documentation as well. And as I said, this is an ongoing project. And then the other thing a lot of this research has helped us get ready for is the fact that last year we were able to purchase the building that sits next to our Jeremiah Lee mansion, which is a 1768 Georgian mansion built by Jeremiah Lee, as I said, in 1768. But at the same time, he also built a detached brick kitchen next to it, which you see here in the pictures here. And what's amazing about this is that we believe, and this comes from town lore, although it goes pretty far back into the 19th century, that this was also built to serve as the slave quarters for Lee's enslaved individuals. And so being able to buy this building is amazing on so many different levels. And over the course of the next number of years, we'll be researching it. We'll be researching the enslaved people that lived and worked there. We'll be doing archaeology and all sorts of things. And the culmination of which will be to open the building up, to recreate it as much as possible, open it up and include it on your visit to the site. And so all this research that we've been doing about the community, the diverse community in Marblehead and the individuals themselves is all helping us tell the most appropriate and correct and accurate story we can in this building. So we're very excited.
And we want to conclude on just the brightest of notes. You learned earlier, and I alluded as well, to Joseph and Lucretia Brown. At the same time we were digging into this, a school was being constructed in Marblehead, and that school had to get named. And the way that it was done was each person on the school committee got to nominate one name. Obviously, lots of community input before that. But one school committee member, Ms. Emily Barron, nominated Lucretia and Joseph Brown as the name of the town's under construction elementary school. And Ms. Barron persuaded the others on the school committee to accept this. And now, as of 2021, there's a school in Marblehead bearing the name of our beloved people, our couple, Lucretia and Joseph Brown Elementary School. And on here, I have my cursor. There is a mosaic exterior in the school, and you can see depiction of Lucretia handing out a cookie that she is famous for, Joe Froggers, and Joseph with his fiddle, which in their tavern and meeting place, he did fiddling to aid the frolic there. So that's just the best conclusion we can have for sending our presentation off on a positive note. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Lou. And that certainly is a great tribute to Joseph and Lucretia to name a school after. Thank you very much. It's really fascinating research. Finally, we welcome Beth Bauer, who will focus on sharing a variety of resources that historians and genealogists can use to research their Essex County ancestors, as well as some work that she has done uncovering records and stories. Beth Bauer is a retired archivist and public historian whose research has focused on historic African-American communities in the Boston area and the North Shore. Her current research project centers on the 17th through 19th century African-American community in Salem, Massachusetts. Beth is a board member of the Essex National Heritage, the Historic Beverly, and the Salem Historical Society. Beth also played an integral role in researching and telling the story of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, the first Black graduate of Salem State University. Beth's contributions can be seen at Salem State University as she helped to present the history of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, which led to the creation of the Charlotte Fortin Room. Beth also worked closely with the city of Salem in the naming of Charlotte Fortin Park. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Beth Bauer. Beth?
Thank you, Nate. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about Salem. Thank you. Next slide. the Marblehead folks have spoken a little bit about the African Americans in Essex County guide, but I wanted to talk about it a little more. Next slide. So as they said, it was a 2-year grant-funded project from the Salem Maritime Historic Site Guide. And the central goals of the study were to study the Black history and culture in Essex County, examine the Black presence and silence in the archives. And their findings were these 4 bullets, and I'll explain those a little. One is our archival silence. And as an archivist, what that means to me is that when archives are formed, the people that over many, many, many years, first the record keepers, the people that kept the records they thought they should keep. Secondly, the people who took care of those records over time, took care of them and kept the things they thought were important to keep based on what they thought about their history. Thirdly, the people that took them into archives usually had different goals for what they wanted to have in their archive. So they might have only taken certain records that they wanted and either didn't take all of the records, or they decided to what they call de-accession other records. In other words, gave away or threw away some records. What that all leads to is what is termed archival science. The other thing that can happen is that there can be records within an archive on different topics, but the ability to know that they're there is hampered by the fact that people don't describe all of the content of the records. And this is what has happened historically for records of both women and underrepresented people, whether they be Native American, whether they be of African descent, whether they be from other countries. Sometimes those records either were not collected or they were not promoted as part of the archive, so you don't know they're there. So if you don't actually look in a collection, you won't know because the finding aid or some other guide doesn't tell you that. So that's what we mean by archival science. Disappointment, I think, is connected to that in feeling that you go someplace looking for something about your ancestors or about your culture or about your connections, and they aren't there. And what archivists have come to realize, and researchers, is that sometimes that's not the case. That in fact, there are records there, but they aren't adequately either cataloged or reported in finding aids so you can find them. The third item that they talked about was violence. And that has to do with the fact that as you go back in time, just as things are violent today, things were violent then in different ways. And sometimes that violence was also focused on groups of people. And so if you're looking at your ancestors, you may find information that you is upsetting and difficult to deal with. The fourth area is knowledge and lack of evidence. And this means that by learning that these records are not there, you learn how people were perceived. The other thing that I would say is that as time goes by, there are records that were privately kept, and there are the records of the government. And in Massachusetts, we probably are one of the states in the Union that has the best records from the earlier periods. Birth, marriage, and death records were kept from the beginning pretty much. That's not true in many states, as I'm sure many people have found when they've done genealogical research. So on the one hand, we have a lot of records that do report on everyone. But sometimes those records are not available, or they aren't accessible, either through cataloging or other ways. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly go through. These are the archives and library sites that were visited. You can see that there are quite a number of repositories. Next slide. I will mention that Danvers on the last page, Peabody Historical were part of Salem originally. That's true of other cities and towns on this list. The Phillips Library, I think it's fair to say, was the archives for Salem in a lot of ways. And so you will see that there's not a Salem archives here, but really the Phillips Library has a lot of those. Salem State University has been very good at collecting later 19th and 20th and now 21st century records of Salem. So if you're looking for Salem records, those are some good places to start. But I would say, from my experience with archives, that there are two things to remember. One is that records from every place end up in all the different towns a lot of times, because the towns were dealing with each other. And so the archives for instance, North Andover, I'm sure have some Andover records and probably records from, say, Danvers. And so you want to make sure that you look broadly when you're looking for information about your ancestors. Next slide. These are the themes that come out of the report. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them, but you can see slavery and abolition in Essex County. One of the things that we want to remember for Essex County and Salem in particular is that the first slave ship that left Massachusetts, in other words, containing people who had been captured and enslaved, being Native Americans in 1636, went out of Salem Marblehead area on a ship built by Salem and Marblehead to the Caribbean, where they exchanged the Native Americans for African slaves and brought them back to the Salem Marblehead area. And that was in 1636. So you have a presence from that time period. And not that long after that, there were also free people of African descent that are shown in the records, and into the 18th century. So there was both an enslaved population and a free population in Essex County. I think the other thing we have to remember is that we get in our cars and sometimes moan about how long it takes to get to Andover. But people back in the 17th and 18th century made a lot of those journeys on foot. And Nate had mentioned Charlotte Fortin. Charlotte Fortin loved to walk to hunt. So we have to sort of recalibrate ourselves. Entrepreneurship and Black-owned business, you just heard from the Marblehead Museum with some examples, and there are many more in these archives. Negro Election Day, which was something that was focused more recently in Salem, but started in Saugus and happened in other states as well. Those sources are listed in there. Activism, responses to oppression and inequality, abolitionism, Underground Railroad, 19th, I know the schools exhibit just opened at Penn. So these important things are all in these archives. War and military service, starting with actually the French and Indian Wars in the 18th century. There were certainly people of color that served then, and on through all the wars since then. Links to Essex County, the South and the Atlantic world. Not only did Essex County trade with the Caribbean islands in Africa and imported slaves, but they also were owners of plantations in the Caribbean. And many, Salem I know, and I'm sure Marblehead and other cities had people who owned plantations or had businesses that depended on the plantations. And much of the fish that was captured from this area went to the plantations. So there were a lot of connections. Black women is also a theme and very important, as we've heard again from the previous speakers. And then 20th century racism and activism. Salem State, I know, is very strong in this area, and there are other examples. Next slide. I'm going to give two examples of some research that has been going on recently that's going to echo some of what you've already heard. Next slide. In 1788, the new Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed a law that required that anybody who was not considered a resident of a town had to be warned out of the town. And there was a very formal process that was put in there. The Salem lists of both Negroes and then white people and immigrants were both published in the Essex Institute Historical Collections in the middle of the 19th century. But what we were able to do with the help of the Phillips Library staff was uncover the actual original list of the Negroes who were warned out in December of 1790, as you can see from the cover. Next slide. This is one piece of that list. It lists over 170 households, and I'm going to focus on John Black and his wife, who are the first names on this list. What is incredibly valuable about this list for African-American research is that the list has the state or country the person was from, and the town they were from, and the number of children. And then if you look at the left, it also says John Black and wife. And the X means that they were formally noticed, meaning they were given a piece of paper so that the constable found them and noticed them that they had to leave. Now, I want to say immediately that almost nobody left. I've been working on researching people, and many of them stayed. So they weren't formally dismissed or taken out of Salem. But what you'll see from this list that's most helpful, Rhode Island, as you can see, Primus Green, who I believe may have been enslaved by Nathaniel Green. He was one of his slaves, but was freed after the Revolution and came to Salem. And you can see he's from Greenwich, Rhode Island. There's William Simons from New York State, and then from Boston. So that means that he came first to Boston and then moved up here. Cato Ranson was from Rhode Island as well, via New York. And then we have someone from Virginia, another person from Rhode Island, and then another person from Virginia. So you get a good sense, and this is a great lead on where people are from. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk about one person, John Black, who's at the top of the list. John Black was on the warning out list, but he was not on the 1790 census. And this confused us when we were doing the research. And it wasn't until we looked and found his obituary and compared his probate records and looked at Reverend Bentley's diary that we learned that John Black was the name he took when he was freed. And this is very common on the Salem list, that people decided to change their names. They did not want to be associated with the name of their enslaver. And so John Black was Jack DeLand when he worked. He was enslaved by Mr. DeLand, who bought him from a slave trader in another town in Essex County. And when he died in 1807, there were 2 obituaries published for him, one with the name he chose and one with the name he had when he was enslaved. And these were in 2 different papers, as you can see, and were published within a day of each other. So it gave us a much better idea of what we need to be thinking about when we're doing this kind of research, that people did change their names, that they had been enslaved at one point, that they may not have been enslaved by the same people throughout their enslavement. Next slide. So basically what we learned from those sources is that he was born in Africa. He arrived in Salem at the age of 11 from the West Indies. Whether he spent some years in the West Indies and then was brought to Salem, we are not sure about. His enslavers, he was imported by Captain Foster of Manchester, and he was bought by Benjamin DeLand, and then later worked for the Crown and Shield family. And his first wife was also a servant of the Crown and Shield family. He took his freedom at the Revolution and changed his name from Jack DeLand to John Black. During his later years, he was a truckman and laborer. He did very well. His first wife, as I said, was owned by the Crown and Shields. His second wife, Dinah Guard, who had several aliases, he married in 1807, and she outlived him and went by several names. Jack Black owned a house and land on Fish Street, which he bought in 1797, and his probate record is 69 pages long, which is a very long probate record. I think primarily because he had asked one of the Crown and Shields to be his executor, but when he died, they declined. And so the estate took quite a long time to probate. Next slide. And you will see, this is the 1790 federal census, that Jack DeLand is in the 1790 census. He's not in the census as John Black. His son, John Black Jr., is in the census. So he has a household of 4 persons in 1790. Next slide. The other story I want to tell is about Caesar Augustus. And again, this is about the diversity of resources that we've all been talking about. This is a record from the American Revolution, a receipt of bounty paid to Caesar Augustus by Abner Bailey from the town of Newbury to serve in the Continental Army. People in Massachusetts, men, were allowed to pay people to serve for them. And in these cases, they sometimes either paid an enslaved person or freed someone and paid them, as well as freed people of all nationalities were also paid to serve for people. So Caesar Augustus was probably enslaved by Abner Bailey, although I don't have any proof of that yet. There were several other Caesar Augustuses who served in the Revolution, but I have eliminated all of them. One was from Plymouth, and the other was from Dorchester. Next slide. So he had 5 children, and one of them was Isaac Augustus, who Reverend William Bentley wrote about during in his diary, that on July 1st, 1794, he did a visitation at the schools, and he says we found Blacks in all the writing schools, but no one compared to Isaac Augustus and his handwriting and his abilities. And it turns out that Isaac Augustus's copybook is owned by Harvard University, and they have scanned it and put it online. And so you can see the date, February 9th, 1796, 2 years after Bentley visited the school, that Isaac Augustus book was started. So he had several. Next. And this is one of the interior pages of his copybook with the reference if you want to look it up online. But he was copying a passage in large script and in smaller script as well. Next slide. Caesar Augustus died in 1798, and from that probate, we learn about his entire family. Isaac, who we just saw, Titus, who also went to the school that Bentley visited, Samson, he had a daughter, Nancy, and then he had a son, Jephthah, who died before his father, and a daughter-in-law, Durand. Next slide. And these are the marriages for Isaac Augustus to Mary Black, probably who was related to John Black. And those are on top. Those are from the Salem records. And the bottom are from the Marblehead records, because both Jephthah Augustus and Samson Augustus married women from Marblehead. So, and that's something we find very often, is people moving back and forth and marrying back and forth between Marblehead and Salem. Next slide. Samson Augustus appears in several other sources. One is a remembrance from Robert Rantoul, who grew up in Salem, about how he went to the grammar school and that the school is on a bank called Guppy's Bank, where there was a row of houses tenanted by Negroes. And Sampson Augustus, he describes several people, including Dinah Gard, but he also talks about Sampson Augustus, that he painted for P&A Chase, and his house was painted and had quite an aristocratic look. And then Sampson Augustus is mentioned in Bentley's diary when he dies, and he describes him as a Negro and a painter by trade. He had better claims on public favor than Negroes as they commonly are found among us, and better talent. So that's an example of the hurtful and negative types of things that are mentioned in the new record of what was found in the various archives. There are these kinds of diaries and ads and other kinds of things. I didn't put it in here, but there are ads on the, there was a notice put out by the publisher that was derogatory about Titus Augustus's son. But when Sampson died, besides the notice by Bentley, it was also briefly published in the Salem Gazette. Next slide. Is that it? So that's my presentation about some of the new availability of that study, and also some of the exciting resources that are being found in these archives. What I would say is that while part of the problem of the silence in archives is that things were not collected or not cataloged, the other problem is that we haven't looked everywhere, and we haven't thought broadly about where those resources might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. And I also want to thank Charles, Lauren, Lou for these great presentations. I'm going to take a bit of executive privilege here and ask the first question. I'm actually going to, so I have a question for all of you, and I'm going to ask this question at the end, but so I'm going to give you some time to think about it. So before I ask you all individual questions, the question I want you all to think about and ask at the end is, as part of the research that you've all done, what was perhaps the most surprising thing you saw, or maybe something that you didn't expect and it actually came to light? So I'll save that question at the end for all of you. I want to start with Charles. I'm just going to go in the order of the presentations. Question for you, Charles. You had mentioned Daniel's wife, Nancy. I actually have two questions. Do you know much about her? That would be the first question. And then the second question is, you talked about interracial marriages being illegal, but they were cohabitants, and I'm just curious how they were able to navigate that. Was there any, did they have to do it in secret? How were they able to manage that when they weren't allowed to be married?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, Maine is a big place. I mean, it is a tremendous state to try across. And at that time that they lived there, a lot of wilderness. And I really think it didn't bother anyone. So what people did with themselves, that was that. I don't think the government got involved. And I've been to St. George, and I can imagine what it must have been like back in the early 1800s, because it's a kind of a peninsula that juts out into the ocean. And as for Nancy, it's hard to find things on her. It's very difficult to find things on Nancy. She was, from what I've learned, is she was possibly from Cushing, Maine. And she may have been married before. But that's all I have learned about her.
Thank you, appreciate it. And Lauren, I'm going to go to you. You said something, and I wrote it down. I don't think I caught it all, though. You said Joseph was freed after serving. I think I wrote this down. I can't read my own writing. Joseph was freed after serving as a substitute for his slave man. Did you say more about that? What does that mean?
Sure, that was actually something that Joseph recounted himself in
Okay.
the pension record,
Okay.
which he's submitting later in life. But he does tell the story how he was born enslaved to a man named Beriah Brown. This is in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, and that that Beriah basically said, "I will free you if you serve in place, finish out my son Christopher Brown's term of enlistment." And because it turns out Christopher wanted to go off and be a privateer, which is a much more lucrative and exciting life than, it didn't serve him well because he didn't make it very far. He died pretty soon afterwards. But Joseph says, I served it out. I did what I was told, and he was freed. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Lou, I'm going to go to you. You had referenced something about Agnes, and I can't read my own writing. It was fascinating conversation, so I was trying to listen and take notes. You said something about Agnes and where she was, something about her burial site was different, or not in a place where traditionally would have been. Can you say more about that? You're muted. You're muted.
And
There
I'm
you go.
trying.
That's okay.
I am. Okay, Nick, thanks. And what a neat point to bring up for a little more elaboration. It was typical for enslaved people to be interred, sadly, in unmarked mass burial sites in an area called Back Street around town. And Marblehead Racial Justice Team and Marblehead Museum are collaborating on bringing that to light more. So we have knowledge of the area where enslaved people were unceremoniously buried. And it so happens that this lady, Agnes, who you can see we happily have been able to document her life, did get a decent burial there on Old Burial Hill. So that is what that's about. That's an answer.
Yep. Thank you very much. And then actually, Lauren, Beth, before I go to you, Lauren, I'm going to come back to you because that's something I forgot. You had mentioned you had talked about the connection between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and you gave an explanation, or maybe it was interpreted what the explanation was. But I'm just curious. Do you align with that explanation? Or do you have your own?
I would love to spend more time looking into this. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. My Alexa alarm just went off. Love to do more research on it. I'm making a sort of educated guess right now, and that is that we know that Marblehead's Glover's regiment served sometime in the early-ish parts of the war. I think it was 1778, down in Rhode Island, sort of guarding the waterfront area. And we also know that that these folks who, Joseph Brown being one in particular, there were also some other people that appear on this later warning out list, were from that area, either North or South Kingstown, Rhode Island, or surrounding communities. And so my theory is, and that they served in the war. So my theory is perhaps that these two regiments, the Marblehead Regiment and some of the Rhode Island regiments, somehow served alongside each other, whether they were stationed nearby or doing the same thing, protecting one of the forts or something in Rhode Island. How that then translates to getting all these folks from Rhode Island up to Marblehead, I don't entirely know. Right before the war, Marblehead is a very active seaport town, and there's a lot of trade going on. There's fishing, among other things. Maybe there were more jobs available. that's certainly not necessarily as true after the Revolutionary War, but maybe they didn't know that. And like I said, I really do think if someone could take this on, it would be an amazing research project. So I don't really have a great answer for you right now.
Thank you, appreciate it. And Beth, you had mentioned some themes, and you listed some of those themes, and I'm just curious, was there a theme that offered considerable resources or research, and was there a theme that was just very difficult to find any information on among the themes that you listed?
I have to say that's probably a question for Cabria and Liz, but I would say that probably, I think what happened was that they were pleased, and Lauren can also speak to this because she's also, they were one of the museums. I think they were pleased about some of the things they found, especially the 20th century stuff that they found that had been collected. And so I think that the themes came out of what they found. They didn't have the themes to start out.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I would imagine you talked about enslaved, and then they become free and they change the name. I would imagine that makes it difficult for research purposes when they're I would imagine when they change their name, now if you were doing research on this particular individual, then they change the name to something else, that may pose some problems. Just a thought. Thank you.
It is.
Thanks. And then I have a question for all of you, and and I'll start with you, Beth, since you're on my screen. Out of the work that you've done, what did you find most surprising in your research? Anything stand out?
I think that what surprised me the most was and I think it came up in what Lauren was talking about too. I had there's a man named Titus Cabot, who was actually a privateer agent. He was African American. He was a privateer agent in Salem. And the way that I learned that he had children was because his daughter died at the age of 100. And I mean, I've actually found this on somebody's tree on Ancestry, that the death record listed him as her father. And I never knew he was married. And I now know that his wife's name was Venus. So, and actually he changed his name because he was born in he was enslaved by the Gardeners. And then when Gardner died, his wife married a Cabot, so he changed his name. So it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's the surprise.
Thank you. Charles?
Yes, Nate.
Anything stand out for you in your research?
In my research, I think the thing that struck me the most, as I mentioned, is that the willingness of people who don't even know you to go above and beyond your research. I mean, particularly archivists and librarians. It's amazing the things I have learned about my family, just by people willing to donate their time, to volunteer their time. And because they're fascinated by the story. And it's an unusual story. Many people can't trace, many Black people cannot trace their families back as far as I can. And it's true what someone just said about Massachusetts having such great record keeping. And it's true. There was no civil war here to burn the records. So
right.
Things have been remained intact. It is, and I'm just very, very fortunate and I thank my mother too for maintaining these things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Lauren, I'm throwing the question to you.
Sure. Well, so many amazing things that I've learned, but I guess what struck me most recently that comes to mind is the number of people, and this is right in the vital records that are available online, in the town of Marblehead, the number of people of African descent who spent time in the workhouse, the poorhouse, almshouse, they were called all the various things, and died there, versus, I mean, as a percentage of the population, so many more people of color spent time and especially lived out their last days at the workhouse. And I think that speaks to a number of things, of course, but issues of familial wealth and inheritance. I mean, same things that people struggle with today. And it's just, it's sad. It's a sad testament, but I found it interesting.
Thank you. And Lou.
You, Nate, got into the discussion with Lauren a little bit about that list about Rhode Island. That's where I'm going to answer your question. This concept of warning out. We didn't have time today to really delve into that, but that's a very kind of elaborate and complex kind of thing. And it ties into what Lauren just said about how many Afro-American people did have to end up in the poorhouse. And a concept of this warning out was that you were less likely to be eligible for government assistance. There was widespread government assistance back then, but by warning out, it became more acceptable that you wouldn't be eligible for some of the assistance programs. And Beth has done just marvelous kind of explanations of this in some of her other programs. I'd like to recommend that to all of you. But that was what was surprising to me, learning more about warning out. And I really want to get more into that. We had that one little snippet about the difference between Rhode Island and Massachusetts people on that list. But there's numerous other warning out things that can be looked at and that were surprising. So thanks.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. And the first question is, Lewis mentioned a backwater burial area. Makes me wonder, was this a typical practice in other Essex County communities? So I guess that can be answered by anyone. If anyone have knowledge of that? No? Okay. All right. And then another question is, was there Black churches in Essex County like the, I may pronounce this wrong, Abyssinian Church in Portland, Maine?
There were, can you hear me, Nate?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. In Salem, there were congregations in the early 19th century that focused somewhat, they weren't just Black churches, but they welcomed, not that everybody didn't welcome, but they really welcomed. But then the Redmonds and two abolitionists who actually were politically on different sides got together, Prince Farmer and John Redmond. And they, a sailor died at sea and left his estate for the purposes of building a church for the Black community. And they raised money for years to build a church. So I'm not remembering off the top of my head the name of it, but yes. And then later there were Methodist churches that were Black churches.
Thank you. Lauren, I see you put something in the chat. I don't know if you'd like to just speak to it.
Sure, happy to. In Marblehead, at least, I'm not aware, and Lou can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not aware of a particular congregation like that. However, we have found records of people, Black people participating in the other congregations in town that existed in the 18th and early 19th century, which included the Episcopal or Anglican at that time and Congregational. churches. And I was going to say something else and it slipped my mind, so I'll stop there.
It's okay.
Nate,
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Nate, can I follow up on
Sure,
that?
please.
Lauren just reminded me, St. Peter's Church in Salem. During the it was a Loyalist church, but then in the late 18th century and into the 19th century, there were an incredible number of baptisms and burials of people from the African-American community, which we've just noticed that, and we feel like we need to sort of chase that down. And it's right next to where Prince Farmer and Venus Chew's grave sites are. So it sort of questions whether that there's a combination there, that something was happening at the Episcopal Church.
If I may follow up real quick.
Please.
I'm curious, hearing Beth talk about these congregations, if the people in Marblehead being so close and maybe other surrounding communities went into Salem to worship at this congregation. Because the other thing is the number of people in Marblehead, the people of color, drops quite a bit. I mean, the most that we know of was in the 1765 census, and it goes down from there. By the mid to late 19th century, there's very few, at least, that show up in the census records. It's also very sad that the diversity of the town actually gets worse over time.
Thank you. So I'm being mindful of the time. And so I'm gonna wrap it up. I do want to once again thank our presenters, Charles Shaw, Lauren McCormack, Lou Meyi, and Beth Bauer. A really great presentations, very informative. And I want to thank you all for attending this program, which was hosted again by Essex Heritage and Salem Ancestry Days. And by the way, Salem Ancestry Days started today, and they go through May 2nd. And for more information, you can go to salemancestry.org. Please remember that a recording of tonight's program will be put up on the Essex Heritage YouTube channel. And again, I want to thank the audience for participating. I want to thank our presenters, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.